This lie about NATO expansion has gone on for too long, and we need to do something about it. Basically, it says that it's NATO's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine twice, 2014 and 2022. I think some people repeating this lie are poor waifs in their underwear, and they are going to repeat it no matter what, like it's their job, because it probably is. But other people are simply mistaken, and this video is for those who are mistaken. So let's get into it. There does not seem to be any absolute evidence that this promise was even made. It was certainly discussed by sort of analysts and commentators, but two very authoritative figures say that there is no such promise, one of those being Gorbachev, of all people. In an interview with German television, he said that the promise was a myth created by the media.
Die Frage stellte sich damals gar nicht.
Das heißt, es ist ein Mythos, dass Sie vom Westen bezüglich der NATO-Osterweiterung betrogen wurden?
Ja, das ist tatsächlich ein Mythos. Da hat die Presse, die liebe Presse, ihre Hand im Spiel gehabt.
And in the same series, Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the last Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union, said that there were no such discussions as far as he was aware. Next, do Russians think that the main effect of the invasion is to push back NATO? Well, it doesn't seem so. According to a Levada Center poll, which is the best data we have, only 15% of Russians think that pushing back NATO is what they're going to get from this invasion. A plurality of 29% believe that it's to add territories to Russia in the good old tradition of Russian imperialism. And for anyone who thinks that there may be legitimate claims by Russia to Ukraine's territory, please keep in mind that they have the same pretensions on all of their European neighbors and some non-European neighbors as well.
Все эти государства на территории бывшего Советского Союза, они выдуманные, они фальшивые.
Here you can see Dmitry Medvedev calling Finland a fake country created by Bolsheviks, which is exactly the same thing that they said about Ukraine. There were also several majority Ukrainian areas east of Ukraine's 1991 borders, which at different points in history sought either political independence or union with Ukraine, most notably the Kuban region, which was populated by Ukrainian Cossacks after the little-known and little-discussed Circassian genocide. But that's a whole other history. So there's certainly no claim by Russia to Ukraine's current 1991 borders, which of course Russia recognized, keep that in mind too, in multiple treaties, in the Friendship Treaty and in the Budapest Memorandum, and also in this statement which Putin made after they annexed part of Georgia in 2008.
Цели Крым и Севастополь такой целью для России?
Вы сказали следующей целью. У нас не было и здесь никакой цели. Поэтому считаю, говорить о какой-то следующей цели некорректно. Это первое.
Вы это исключаете?
Если вы мне позволите ответить, то вы будете удовлетворены. Значит, Крым не является никакой спорной территорией. И Россия давно признала границы сегодняшней Украины. Мы, по сути, закончили в целом и в общем наши переговоры по границе.
So that's a quick tangent addressing Russia's claim to Ukraine's territory, but I wanted to make it because it's important to contrast this NATO argument, which is the rumor of a promise. You can't even pin down that the promise was made, while on the other hand, you have explicit treaties and explicit public statements coming from the Russian side, and it's frustrating how Russian propaganda, the Russian point of view, the promises of not expanding NATO are what tend to dominate the conversation. But let's get back to supposed Western and NATO and American actions toward Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, did the West attempt to pull former Soviet states away from Moscow's influence? No, it did exactly the opposite. In his famous Chicken Kiev speech, President Bush urged Ukrainians not to secede. Fortunately, they ignored him, and a few months after the speech, a clear majority in all regions of Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass, voted for secession. After that, did the West try to turn former Soviet states against Russia? No, the West worked to disarm them. The United States and Britain helped broker the Budapest Memorandum, by which Ukraine gave up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And Russia, in that same Budapest Memorandum, promised to, quote, respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine and refrain from the threat or use of force. But of course, Russia disdains treaties, has a long history of disdaining treaties. Foreign Minister Lavrov ridiculed the Budapest Memorandum after Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine. The Budapest Memorandum was not the only time that the West helped disarm Ukraine. The Non-Lugar Threat Reduction Agreement, or cooperative, whatever it's called, started in the 90s and went into the mid-aughts, and under it, Ukraine destroyed many bombers and long-range missiles, exactly the sort of capabilities that it is sorely lacking in 2022. So let's jump to the year 2010 and touch on Obama's great reset of relations with Russia. But before we do that, let's quickly review some high points, or I should say low points, of Russia's behavior in the 20 years that preceded that. So from the collapse of the Soviet Union to 2010, because this really puts in context what the West was trying to do and how hard they were trying to pretend and to hope that Russia will be just a normal country. So Russia devastated Chechnya in the 90s, killing, and people don't appreciate this, killing, depending which casualty figures you believe, somewhere between like 8 and 15 or maybe even 20% of Chechnya's entire population in a very brutal war. Next, in 1999, Yeltsin, this was revealed by recently declassified documents, Yeltsin asked President Clinton to give Europe to Russia, suggesting that Europe isn't America, it's none of America's business, you should just give Europe to Russia. I suspect that American officials kind of thought that this was still a hangover from the Soviet Union and it would all just go away. Maybe it was a weird joke, and that Russia would be a normal country. Russia never really stopped making nuclear threats whenever they got something that they didn't want. For example, they received criticism during the Chechen War saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't level a major city because there are a few thousand fighters, guerrilla fighters in it, level Grozny. And Russia responded with a nuclear threat. Russian agents poisoned Alexander Litvinenko in London using radioactive poison. In 2008, just 2 years before the years that we're talking about, they invaded Georgia and annexed 20% of their territory, also in a war that was very brutal and marked by marauding and completely unnecessary brutality. So in 2010, what does the U.S. do? We have our Great Reset, yet another naive attempt to treat Russia just like any other country that respects the rule of law. And here is a photo of U.S. soldiers marching with their Russian counterparts in Red Square, commemorating victory in World War II. And just 3 years after that, despite all this behavior that we just mentioned, just 3 years later, in 2013, the last U.S. tanks leave Europe. People don't appreciate that either. For the first time in 70 years, there were no American tanks in Europe. And the year after that, we have the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, and let me address this briefly. For a more detailed sort of description of the propaganda, you can read my essay, Putin's Libertarians. The propagandists love saying that it was a CIA coup. It did not. I think there's zero evidence for that. What help was received from the West seemed to me like very little and very, very appreciated. It was a middle-class revolution. The first spark of it was some association treaty with Europe, a completely unimportant treaty that would have done nothing. But the Russian puppet president and former election fraudster canceled the treaty very abruptly. And then, more seriously, in response to protests, he passed all of these dictatorial laws that ultimately banned any form of protest in Ukraine. And it was a really scary time It really felt like Ukraine's future was hanging on a knife's edge, whether it might become a freer country as people wanted, or it might slide back into the Soviet Union. The protesters disregarded those orders. I myself spent a couple nights on Maidan during that Revolution of Dignity. And things got really scary. They started killing protesters. They would pull them out of their hospital beds. Protesters who were injured and went to nearby hospitals. One was pulled out of his hospital bed, beaten really severely, and left in a forest where he froze to death. About 100 people were killed. Later on in the protest, they just started shooting people in the middle of the protest camps. Really scary time. The protesters deserve nothing but our respect and admiration, in my opinion. Aside from that, it didn't at all seem to me that the protesters, the millions of people, were motivated by what the propagandists were saying was payment from the CIA. The CIA just paid people to protest. These were largely middle-class people, including all of the developers at the software company where I would work. They would drop their work and go support the protests, whatever chance they got. So I just see zero evidence that it was a coup, not to mention the fact that the protests ended in elections, and that since then there have been another set of presidential elections that resulted in a complete change of power. So the protests were a democracy movement. So that was the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. It was followed, of course, by Russia's first modern invasion of Ukraine and the annexations of Crimea and parts of Donbass. And only after invasion did public opinion in Ukraine skew towards joining NATO. Until then, it could probably have been described as pro-Western, but anti-NATO. And then, after being invaded, Ukraine became like its Eastern European neighbors, prioritizing the defense against Russia. And this leads to the most important argument, the one more important than anything I've said previously, against the idea of an aggressive NATO expansion. NATO did not expand because of an aggressive West or an aggressive United States. NATO expanded because the people living close to Russia remember the living hell that Moscow once created on their soil and to this day threatens to create again.
Это русские люди, в которых вселился бес. Вот. И мы идем их не убивать, мы хотим, чтобы их переубедить. Но если вы не хотите, чтобы мы вас переубеждали, мы вас убьем. Убьем сколько нужно, убьем 1 миллион, 5 миллионов, хоть всех истребим. Пока вы не поймете, что вы бесноватые и вам надо лечиться.
And I'll review some highlights for emphasis. They may seem like long ago and far away for people who live in the US or elsewhere in the West, but my goodness, in Eastern Europe, they are very, very recent and very raw. Finland remembers losing 10% of their territory, and they still celebrate Eugene Schauman, who all the way back in 1904, more than 100 years ago, assassinated the Governor-General Nikolai Bobrikov, who was appointed by the Russian Tsar to make Finland Russia. Estonia remembers March 25th, 1945, which was the biggest of many deportations that happened. 20,000 Estonians were loaded onto cattle cars and deported to Siberia, most of them never to return. Latvia remembers June 14th, 1941, when 15,000 Latvians met the same fate. These deportations, like most deportations, targeted a society's elite. They wanted to chop off the sort of decision makers, the people who define culture, and leave a society of peasants and make them Russia. Incidentally, Ukraine lost 80% of its intelligentsia during the purges of the Soviet Union. 80%. That's professors, writers, small entrepreneurs, people like that. Lithuanians had similar experiences, and they also fought with their Baltic brothers in the Forest Brothers, which was a guerrilla organization, and they fought the Soviet Union into the mid-50s. Think about that. World War II was long gone in America. Elvis Presley was recording music, and in Eastern Europe, World War II never ended, and people were still fighting for their survival. Poland remembers the Katyn massacre, another target of a society's elite. And they remember how Soviet officials used to joke that if you beat a Polish man long enough, he becomes a Russian. There was the Fanta Alba massacre, where unarmed Romanian refugees were killed, and many of the survivors were tortured, executed, or sent to Siberia, presumably just for witnessing the crime. I could mention Slovakia, Czechia, and many others, but I think you get the point. The propaganda insists that the people in question have no agency, that they are neutral pawns to be fought over by Moscow and NATO, but nothing could be further from the truth. And I'll also add that the ascendancy of many of these countries into NATO was not easy. It's exactly the opposite of what you would expect if you're trying to support this thesis that NATO expanded aggressively. The US originally opposed the ascendancy of Romania and Slovenia. Poland spent almost 10 years petitioning and negotiating to join NATO, which incidentally is the same thing that Turkey had to do all the way back in the 1950s, back when the Soviet Union was still a new thing. Stalin began threatening Turkey, and to demonstrate their sort of support for the West, Turkey even sent soldiers to the Korean War. The point is that, like Poland, they had to go through a process, and they had to make a very strong argument for them to join the treaty, the NATO. NATO never aggressively expanded. It was and remains a defensive alliance, and it's only anti-Russian to the extent that Russia is just about the only entity who's always threatening everybody's annihilation. If Russia could ever stop being aggressive, everything would calm down. But to do that, Russia needs to drop their paranoia and their obsession with world domination. And both of those things seem very central to sort of the Russian spirit. I mean, in Russia, there are even fictional accounts by Russian publishers of them taking over the world. Quite a few, but that's a topic for another video. And lastly, let's also notice that when Russia did launch their full-scale invasion in February 2022, it's not like the West encouraged Ukrainians to fight. On the contrary, they offered Ukraine's President Zelensky a way to evacuate Ukraine, which would have made it even more difficult for Ukraine's defenders. So I hope this has been of interest. If so, please do something special for me and be one of my first 1,000 subscribers. Until next time.